Hello everyone, my name is David D. Nicola, and today I will be discussing with you the history of one of gaming's first companies, Atari. Let's begin. If you guys would like a brief overview of what Atari has to offer, you can check out this video I have linked here. Atari began with a man called Nolan Bushnell back in 1962. Him and his co-creator, Ted Dabney, had created one of the first video games ever invented, which was called Space War. It was invented at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology with help from a couple of his classmates and his professor. This was one of the first video games, as I said, but back in the day, video games weren't played publicly. Most of them had to be played on big computers that were used privately by professors. And yeah, so he would sneak off from his classes to go play this game that he had created. And Bushnell realized the potential of these games while he was working a summer job at the arcades. And he realized this and thought that this had the potential to be something big. In 1972, him and Ted Dabney had created a prototype of a ping pong game, a type of pong. So basically, it's ping pong, just digitized. And they placed the prototype in one of the nearby bars. And it turned out to be a complete success. It was a massive hit, and one of the guys that they were friends with had told them that the game wasn't working, so they went to go check it out, and there were too many quarters in the pan, which had caught the quarters, so you could tell that made it seem like a fantastic hit. For one day, the units were $40, and they were selling great. 2,500 units were ordered by the end of 1973, and 8,000 units were in bars and restaurants and such by the end of 1974. Now, after this, Atari really got the ball rolling and started going corporate. At this point, Bushnell was really starting to think about the future of Atari, so he had laid off his co-partner Ted Dabney, and then Bushnell eventually sold off Atari to a company known as Warner Communications in 1976 for $28 million, 15 of which Bushnell would receive. Now this really turned out fantastic for Atari because of the income of what Warner's made really helped them a lot. They were able to make 70% of what Warner's income was at the end of '82 and at the release of the 2600, which was their newest gaming console, their first gaming console. Now they had other games, but one of the games that really blew up was a game called Space Invaders. You may have played it. It's a little spaceship, and you're shooting the aliens that are coming down from the top of the screen. Now this game was originally just an arcade game, but the creators and the developers had the game ported over to the 2600, and it became a massive hit. This was one of the first games that had sold 1 million copies in 1 year alone, which was amazing at the time. Like, not many games had done this. When it reached 1980, the Atari 2600 had sold up to 2 million units, and 2 years later, in '82, it had reached annual sales of up to 10 million units sold, which is crazy. Looking back on today's standards, seeing these type of games doesn't do the system justice. You may look at a game like E.T. and say, oh my god, this looks like crap. But back in the day, these type of games were amazing. Like, you couldn't get this type of game anywhere else. And plus, you're playing these games at your home, and you don't have to use quarters or go to the arcades. That just blew everyone's mind. And here, I have 4 of the big selling games. Well, 3 of the big selling games from Atari. Going from top left, we have Atari's Adventure, which had released in 1980. It was one of the first adventure games, and included one of the first, but not official, Easter eggs in the game, where the developer of the game had snuck in a code where it would say his name in his secret room. So, yeah, it wasn't the first official one, but it was a really cool thing for people to find out and see. In the bottom left, we have Pitfall, which is a pretty good game back in the day. It released in 1980, and it's one of the best-selling games on the system, with 4 million copies sold. We got Space Invaders in the bottom right. Like I said previous, sold 1 million copies in its first year. And in the top right, we have the infamous E.T. the Extraterrestrial. Now, it sold fairly well. It sold 4 million copies, but it is widely thought of as the worst video game of all time. And we will get there to talking about the E.T. controversy in the next slide. Now, like I said, E.T. did sell pretty well back in the day, but not many people really saw it that way. They did see that it was a crappy game, and are blaming it for some of the worst gaming in history, if not the worst game in history. And before we go into it, in the top right, there is a video game commercial for the game, so if you want to check that out, you can. But yeah, people were so excited to see the game that people loved the movie, so you would think everyone loved the game. But the problem is, Steven Spielberg wanted this game released with 5 weeks before Christmas. He wanted it in time for the holidays, which nobody can do that. It's just unheard of. But Howard Warshaw said that he would take on the challenge, and he thought that it was a good game. And people, you talk to people about what the worst video game of all time is, most people are going to say E.T. But a lot of people haven't played E.T. They just keep on with the legend and whatnot of E.T. being the worst game. So, yeah, there are worse games on this 2600, but people just are living on the legacy and the legend of whatnot of with E.T. being the worst game. And here comes the downfall, or as I like to call it, the pitfall, which is a reference to one of their games. The E.T. controversy really started the downfall of Atari. As you can see on this chart here, they really hit the sky rise in the 80s and 1982, but roughly once 1983 hit, middle of 1982, things really started to go downhill for Atari. Things just weren't looking up. They were having problems with the corporation, and from a quote from Bushnell himself, under Warner, it committed suicide. It wasn't homicide. It was self-inflicted stupidity. And basically, after all this happened, they had essentially buried all the leftover cartridges of the E.T. game that they had. They buried them in New Mexico in a dump. So basically that was their quote-unquote funeral, and yeah, that really ended Atari. And we'll talk about the burial in a minute. Now, the burial was one of the big things about this game that really started a legend. People have said that there were millions of copies of this game buried in this desert, in this dump. But as a documentary called Atari Game Over would tell you, there was not. There were only roughly 800 E.T. cartridges that were buried here, which ironically was only 10% of the games that were there. There were other games such as Adventure, Centipede, and so on, but it wasn't just ET games. The end of 1983 said they dumped the copies into the Alamogordo dump, which is in New Mexico, but in 2014 they had eventually dug it up, which is roughly 30 years after they had essentially buried it. It took 3 to 4 years to plan and to excavate and locate all of these things, and this was a whole excitement thing. There were lines of people trying to get into this dump to see this for themselves, and behold, it was a sight to see. Now, even though Atari may seem like it's been done for a while, they certainly have, but the 2600 wasn't their last console. It was their first, but it wasn't their last. They did have 3 consoles after this. They had the Atari 5200, they had the Atari 7800, and they had the Atari Jaguar. They also had the Atari Lynx, but nobody really talks about that. The 5200 and 7800 really didn't do well. The 7800 sold 3.5 million units, but the 5200 sold a measly 1 million, which is not very good at all. The Jaguar did decent, but developers weren't really sure how to program their games for it, so not many ports were made or games were made for it, which really struggled them down the line. It wasn't really that good, and basically that's where Atari jumped ship. But Atari is not done yet. Now, granted, it's not the same Atari that they were in the 1980s. Nobody from that same company is working on this, but it is the same branded Atari. They are releasing next year. It's at Q2, so probably summer. The Atari box, which essentially is a retro game box of a lot of their old games, some of the new games that are coming out, and whatnot. I don't know much about it. Nobody really knows much about it, but we'll see. One quote did call it a retro revival, which, looking at gaming now, there is a lot of retro gaming. Gold pixelated gaming. Take for instance Sonic Mania, which released this summer. That was a really good game that renaissanced on the old games of Sonic in the 90s, which worked out incredibly well. So, I don't know much to say about the Atari box. I'm going to keep an eye on it, and we'll just have to wait and see where Atari goes from now on.